Hi, and welcome to Women in Philanthropy. This is a podcast about and by women working in philanthropic giving. Grantmakers, fundraisers, executive directors, researchers, advisors. You can't always see behind the scenes in philanthropic giving, and that means you can't see who enables this giving. My name is Michelle Fugel-Gartner. I'm a philanthropic practitioner and researcher. My doctoral research demonstrated that most of what we know about working in philanthropic giving is told to us through a male point of view. This podcast offers the opportunity to hear from women working in giving. The idea for a podcast was inspired by having dim sum with my friends and talking about our roles in philanthropy, our challenges, and our thoughts. Each 15-minute episode will connect you with a woman in philanthropy. You'll hear about her role, how she got there, and how it enables giving. You'll also hear her thoughts on issues such as worth, negotiation, and influence. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you are a woman working in philanthropy and would like to share your story, please get in touch. And now, our Woman in Philanthropy. The Women in Philanthropy podcast is generously sponsored by the Voluntary Sector Studies Network. VSSN promotes understanding of the UK voluntary sector through research and provides a voice and a meeting place for voluntary sector researchers in the UK. Membership is invited from academics and practitioners. For more information, look at the website www.vssn.org.uk. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Women in Philanthropy. This is episode 4, and I am so excited that we have two wonderful women here with us to talk about their roles in philanthropy. Today, we have Doctors Steph Haydon and Janis Petzinger with us, and this is a very special episode. We have two people, so buckle up because this might be a bit longer, but I'm very excited because we all completed our PhDs together at the University of St. Andrews last year. And It's very exciting to have female researchers in the field of philanthropy speak to us today. So hi, Steph. Hi, Janis. How are you?
Hi, Michelle.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. It's my privilege. I love what you guys research, and I'm so excited to share it with everybody else. So now you are both doctors. What are you doing now? What is your role in philanthropy?
Yeah, so I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of St. Andrews at the Center for the Study of Philanthropy and Public Good. I'm essentially here to research philanthropic foundations and how they practice relational philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, how foundations are bringing in new knowledge into their grant-making practices and trying to bring more theory to the field, essentially.
And does that connect at all to the research you did for your PhD?
It's kind of an extension, really, of my dissertation. But now I have the privilege of, oh my gosh, opening up my worldview a bit more and not being stuck in one specific time, which was philanthropy during COVID. And now I'm kind of exploring the aftermath of all of that.
And Steph, how about you?
So I am also a postdoctoral research fellow. I'm now at the Third Sector Research Centre at the University of Birmingham. And I am working on a big research project in charity and philanthropy with about 10 other colleagues across the UK, looking broadly at charity in the National Health Service, so in our NHS, and kind of looking at between the establishment of the NHS back in 1948 and today, what role has charity played? What does it play? How does that align with public expectations? How has this changed over time? How is it shaping and shaped by different kind of changing responsibilities of the state?
In your background, when you came into, however you got into the PhD in the first place, was philanthropy at all in your background, in your education, in your courses, in your networks? Like how did you get to philanthropy? Because like you said, the field is very nascent. Well, the field's not nascent. The research on the field is nascent. And so how did you actually find your way into this role as researchers?
I like to say that I fell into it accidentally. So
many did.
Yeah, I think like the majority of people who grew up in the UK, as I did, we had sort of some exposure to charity philanthropy in our everyday lives, through school fundraisers, through charity days, through that kind of thing. But from a research perspective, I didn't encounter it at all really until I was then at university doing my undergraduate degree. And I took a class that really helped shape my thinking on that. And it was through that, 1 semester long course of kind of being exposed to all these different ideas and raising all these different questions about what is philanthropy, what is a philanthropist, who decides that, what kind of ways is it shaping society for better or for worse, and just kind of critiquing those, not necessarily criticizing, but critiquing and questioning and asking those difficult questions of these different themes and going, wow, this is so interesting. This is something I'd never really given sufficient thought to before. And then I just kind of was in that world from then on of going, this is incredibly interesting. This is something that fascinates me. There's so many different things going on. It's such a rich field, as both of you have said. And what a privilege to be able to engage with it in this way and to be, as researchers, it is our job, but also our passion to be engaging with these different actors, institutions, ideas all day long, and to see how we can question, support, improve, critique the different practices that take place.
So there was an opportunity to take philanthropy and CSR, corporate social responsibility, at the same time. And I just felt like those are really going to go well together. And one of the things I was struggling with in management was studying like private enterprise for one class and then something like NGO ethics. So I decided to really like stick into one like thematic thing because at that point I knew I wanted to have a career that dealt with like social problems in management, essentially.
I am glad you guys both brought up management because that's something I wasn't thinking about bringing up, but we all studied philanthropy through the lens of management. And if you could just give me a snapshot of what value do you think that adds to studying philanthropy? I mean, you guys both know mine. I mean, mine was that I was adamant that I wasn't going to study philanthropy through business. And it was in that first conversation with our supervisor, he said, management is not business. It's the study of organizations and humans. And I was sold. What about for you guys? Why management?
So management as a lens opens a lot more doors than it closes. It's a really, really broad, I don't even think school is necessarily the right word for it. I don't know what is, but it's a really broad collective of ideas and scholars and theories and topics that it focuses on. And so through that, rather than, as you were saying, in terms of it's not business. So if you were examining like a philanthropic foundation through a business lens, there's a lot of norms that you then have to apply through your kind of investigative work around how this organization should operate. Whereas if you're doing it through the management, it allows kind of a more exploratory approach of kind of going without necessarily having these predefined norms. What are they doing? What does that look like? What are the other options as to how it could be operating? And this is just, one example of sort of looking at a foundation, for example, but the same applies to if you're looking at individuals or charities, or if you're looking at activist groups. All of that falls under this kind of cluster of managing people, processes, things, without those kind of limits as to how to look at it. So that's something that I found really, really useful.
It's more sociological. It's more like looking at like society as a whole, right? And it's like the scholarship, well, there can be very prescriptive scholarship, but that hasn't been the case for us, right? Like our research in management has like leaned into the interpretive quality of organizations and foundations in general and how that applies to them. And I think, like we really struggle to define what a philanthropic foundation is. So studying that through the lens of management is really fascinating and brings up questions of, governance, strategy, normativity, ideology. So I'm going to love asking you guys both this question because it reflect both the role you're doing now, but exactly what you're talking about, the lens you're using to study philanthropy. How does your role enable giving?
I ask it to everybody, but I think for researchers, this is a really important question to ask, especially as we talk about the practical implications of our research, but also the theoretical contributions of our research.
It's about kind of sharing the stories and the insights and the experiences of different philanthropic actors and how they vary and what that means for the different people involved. I think that is enabling giving, because you're highlighting that there's not just one way to give. There are so many different ways of engaging in philanthropy, of being a philanthropist. And, each one will have different implications for both the giver, if we're talking about this just in a giving setting, and who is given to. But I think there's also kind of value in mentioning that from a research perspective, like we've mentioned this idea of kind of critique and kind of critically engaging with different ideas. So it's not just about endlessly supporting everything to do with philanthropy and kind of reinforcing those normative ideals of everything is wonderful all of the time. It's also about critiquing certain ways of giving, for example. And, giving can be wonderful and enriching to society. It can be about recognizing injustices and doing something about it. But that's not all guaranteed. And some ways of giving can do more harm than good. If you're, for example, not looking at kind of the bigger picture within, that giving takes place, if you're not questioning certain practices or norms or assumptions that have led to you to give in that way. And so that's also something that we do in terms of, asking those difficult questions and raising those issues in order to not just support giving, but to question and highlight different types of giving in order to perhaps guide people to different ways of giving than they otherwise would have.
I think our work as academics is about raising questions and trying to understand what the right question it is to ask. I think we're better at asking questions than answering them because in any paper or whatever, right, you have to justify the question. And then the discussion is always, here are the limitations. Here's what we still don't know, right?
Yes.
But I think in terms of bringing that to enabling giving, what that does is it brings like a more rigorous criticality to practice. I think that practitioners should be engaging with these really hard questions. Philanthropy is like a series of hard questions, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, so with my research on relational philanthropy, which basically looks at how foundations are trying to democratize their practices through more engagement with their grant recipients, what I've shown in my research and what I try to hammer out to practitioners that I speak with now is like, we need to recognize what forms of knowledge we're bringing in to our grant making decisions. And where does this knowledge come from? What assumptions underpin this knowledge? And in the relational philanthropy world, what that essentially means is being open to knowledge from grant recipients that you might not otherwise be familiar with or want to fund. So a big part of my work in terms of enabling giving, I think, is helping funders recognize that we're constantly on a journey of bringing in new forms of knowledge. And as we do that, I think it's the role of funders to have learning and integrating learning as a form of strategy. It's a different question in terms of how you feed academic research into practice. That's a really difficult thing that academics have to deal with, mobilizing research into the world of giving. I think that's something that that's a trick that we're still trying to figure out in terms of like taking our research out of the ivory tower and into the field.
Yeah, the best way I've ever heard it described, the one that sticks with me, is that the two bodies, the academics and the practitioners, just operate under different incentives. And it makes it really difficult. So if one is publication and peer review and maybe a slower process, and one is timeliness and speed and implementation, those don't always mesh together very well. And so that helped me conceptualize some of the frustrations I've had with how the two don't speak to each other well enough. But I do think you are on a podcast and you are talking about your research. So you guys both mentioned asking big questions in philanthropy. So I want to ask you a big question, which is, from your point of views, what issue or issues in philanthropy need airing?
For me, I think the biggest issue is kind of the default stereotype assumption of what philanthropy is and around what do we consider to be philanthropy, which mostly comes down to like the scale of it. We think of mainly as like billionaires that kind of count as a philanthropist. Anyone who is less wealthy couldn't possibly be clustered under that. And the term philanthropist is loaded with a lot of norms and assumptions around, who we view as a philanthropist. And to kind of prove a point, before we recorded today, I actually went on to ChatGPT, which for anyone who doesn't know, is an AI chatbot. And I told ChatGPT, I said, name me 10 philanthropists. And it came back with a list of 10 names. All 10 were American. 9 of the 10 were white. None of the 10 were openly LGBT. Actually, 4 of the 10 were women, which was not half, but was higher than I expected it to be. So I said, okay, name me 10 non-American philanthropists then, given all 10 had been American. All 10 of the non-American philanthropists it named were male. And it's just kind of an example of how even this, artificial intelligence that granted is made fundamentally by humans, it is completely entrenched with these assumptions that, okay, when we think of a philanthropist, we think of the Carnegies, we think of the Rockefellers, we think of, for lack of a better way of putting it, old white dudes who are also predominantly straight. So that is a lot of voices. That is a lot of people, a lot of personalities, a lot of experiences, both good and bad and everywhere on the spectrum in between, that are being completely neglected because they're not recognized as philanthropy or as a philanthropist. And so we have all the stories of the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffett, the Carnegie. We don't have the LaTosha Browns. We don't have the Stephanie Shirleys. We don't have the Diane Sabins. And these are all really valuable experiences and insights that need to be shared in order to just diversify those perspectives and have a better, more nuanced understanding of all the different ways that philanthropy can be practiced and all the different people that can touch and things that can change and how that we're just not seeing.
It's almost like someone should start a podcast on women in philanthropy.
Yes, so thank you, Michelle.
I mean, this is it, right? So when I was doing the research on CEOs in foundations, the ones that were writing from their autobiographical experience were all men, all American, early 20th century. And in the middle of my PhD, I had a conversation with a colleague who works in the field. And she said, well, what are some resources of women who wrote about their experiences in philanthropy? And I'm like, well, I'm working on it. And there's not a lot of contemporary examples, in fact. So this is it. I think there's a space to have many more voices talk about what philanthropy is to them, especially if we think of it as our favorite definition of philanthropy, private resources, time, treasure, and talent for public purposes. That's a big bucket of time, treasure, and talent. It's not just billionaires' treasure that casts as philanthropy.
I mean, well, and when you think about like the word of philanthropy, which means or translates from the Greek as love of mankind, love of humankind, what does it mean to love in general, right? Like everyone has like different ideas of what that means and how we like bring that to helping society. We struggle to understand the truth of what's happening behind foundations and their closed doors. Not to be all conspiratorial, but they're like very famously difficult institutions to access. And we all, maybe
they're difficult unless you're working inside one, and then it's common sense.
Right,
so
exactly.
It's difficult for some of us to see inside, but not others.
Well, and I think that can lead to a lot of like really taken for granted practices. Things that just are, like every day, this is how we do it. When like, actually, if we want to create the radical change in society that we're talking about, maybe you should also integrate some of those lessons. How are you diversifying your board? How are you bringing in new knowledge from the ground? What does that actually look like for you internally? I think I struggle with that in terms of like, I want to support foundations. I want to support philanthropy, but sometimes it's hard when all you hear are words.
It's difficult. I mean, I think translating the ideas and the aspirations into organizational practices, like we learned in management, is really challenging. And I agree with you. I don't think we've seen the best of it yet. I think there's a lot of work to do. I also would highlight the data gap that we have about foundation data. So a lot of the stuff we're using is quantitative, administrative, and employment data to understand what's happening inside foundations. And so, we could use some more qualitative researchers,
Absolutely,
understanding practices and individuals and maybe roles. We're getting into one of my favorite parts of this podcast, and put your thinking caps on. This is the rapid fire portion. I want to know both of your favorite worst philanthropic jargons.
Impact.
Yeah.
Straight off the bat, impact. It is everything and nothing all in the same. Everyone says, oh, we care really about impact. And you go, but what does that mean? Like, everything that you do in life, not just in philanthropy, will have an impact. And that can be both positive and negative. And it can be both positive and negative at the same time and to different people. And people are using it at the moment to kind of imply just positive impact that they kind of can take ownership for, of saying, we had this impact. But you go, well, actually, you're not necessarily going to be talking about the kind of less positive, different perspectives of what counts as positive aside, the less positive aspects of your quote unquote impact. And you're also then kind of assuming that you can very, very neatly draw a straight line from what you did to the impact that created, when actually in most cases, there's a plethora of organizations and individuals working on any one particular issue. And you cannot definitively say that result came just from you or directly from you. And if you're trying to kind of put that nice little bow on it, you're putting kind of an end point on when you start looking at impact and stop looking at impact. And impact is going to continue for years and years and years beyond whatever it is that you did. So it's messy, and the nice little neat term impact just doesn't do enough.
I love it.
It's also I think impact is like, I'm sorry, this is a hot take. I think impact is like a violent word. Like impact in a car accident.
Yeah.
It's like you arriving and with force changing something. And I feel like it's way too heavy, way too many assumptions laden in it. Yeah, that's a good pick, Steph. My other one would probably be traditional philanthropy. When people say this isn't traditional philanthropy, or
why is
I don't practice traditional philanthropy. There are so many different traditions in philanthropy. Usually when people say it, they're trying to serve as a departure from old school paternalistic practice. But
it's less fun to say old school paternalistic practice. Actually, it's pretty fun. It's hard to say.
Actually, yeah. Maybe we should bring that forward. But yeah, traditional philanthropy is mine.
Oh, I love it. Thanks for bringing those up. I just wholeheartedly agree with what you said. Impact is everything and nothing. So I think we need to question it more and what we mean by it, how we measure it, how we use it with our grant making. Mm-hmm. All right. On another side of the coin, a lighter note, let's say, what's the most inspiring trend or trends, practice, or people that you're seeing right now?
I'm really inspired by the trust-based philanthropy movement that's happening. This idea that funders need to trust the lived experience of their grant recipients if they want to fund them effectively, instead of trying to, impact them through, comes from knowledge that comes from the top, right? A predetermined idea of what success looks like. Whereas trust-based philanthropy is about letting grant recipients lead, which is around essentially giving long-term unrestricted grants, and takes nonprofits out of the nonprofit starvation cycle where they constantly have to underreport on overheads and basically beg for funding and live in a project-based grant until the next project-based grant, right? So trust-based philanthropy, I think, tackles some of those issues. There's still a lot of learning left to do. Creating relationships is a part of establishing trust, and that's hard work. That takes a lot of time. Then that brings up issues of favoritism. Am I funding just the same person over and over again because I trust them? That's a difficult reality.
That's a really good point.
I think as a whole, it's moving. It's reigniting conversations around knowledge and grant making that really needs to happen.
I completely agree. What I was going to say is unrestricted giving, which is absolutely, you said it, it's part and parcel of what you were just talking about. And it's all about recognizing and respecting the skills, experience, expertise that a lot of these, organizations that are receiving, big grants or small grants for that matter, already have about whatever kind of social or environmental cause it is that they are predominantly tackling. They already have that knowledge base. They already have that, track record and the ability to do what it is that they're doing. So just kind of, giving them the resources and saying, do with it what you think is best, because it allows them to, address issues that they identify as they define them in ways that they know are going to be successful based on their knowledge and experience, and without extensive, burdensome reporting requirements to kind of follow it up.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you guys both mentioned that. I think it's a really important trend, and I hope it's finding its time. It feels like it's been here for a long time. It's always been an option. And so the fact that it's getting a lot more attention and a lot more implementation is so positive. And I don't want the pendulum to swing. I don't want it to swing back. So it'll be interesting. I think researchers have a really good opportunity to view what's happening within trust-based philanthropy, but specifically unrestricted giving practices, how they're expanding, or whatever the trajectory happens to be. Okay. Go ahead. Say it.
It's just so ironic that they're called trusts.
Yeah.
Like, it's in their name. That's your job.
It really is. I mean, I think the other thing too is I always think about individual givers, and when you're making a gift of any kind, or you're giving your time or anything that you're using for your philanthropy, there's always a huge amount of trust in it. Yeah. It's just so inherent to the whole opportunity of giving a gift. So it seems strange that it's a trend, let's say it feels like it's baked in. But I'm interested to see where it goes. I'm optimistic. All right. Good. So the last question I have for you guys, then what is the next needed role in philanthropy? I think this will be interesting from researchers' point of views. Is there something in academics we need? Is it outside? What do you guys think?
So this is a really interesting one to think about, because I think all of us can kind of identify so many different roles and actors and organizations that are already kind of flooding the philanthropy field. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think the issue is that they're not all speaking the same language to each other. And they're all kind of coming in with different values and assumptions and different priorities and needs. And just kind of sometimes talking at each other rather than with each other, or not talking to each other at all because they don't know that the other one exists. And so I think what you kind of need is, for lack of a better term, like translators, negotiators, people that can be these, I don't want to say intermediary, because that's a whole kettle of fish on its own right, but just
like an emissary.
Yeah, someone
emissary, that's good.
In between that can point people. Yeah, because there's one of the things that kind of highlighted from my research is a lot of philanthropists love to do something new. And that's what they're all about. They're like, I want to do something brand new, whether that's, tackling a cause that's completely neglected, or setting up a brand new organization, or doing things in a way that they believe no one else is doing. And actually, a lot of the time, it's not completely new. It's not completely novel to be doing whatever it is they're doing in whatever sector they're doing it. They just don't know about the organizations and people that are already there. And so you kind of need these little voices to come up and go, oh, by the way, here's all these things that are happening, and the ways in which you can work with them, and translating the values of one into the practices of the other, to say, okay, that's great that you want to do all those things. Here's why that might not necessarily be the best, because of how it will impact what they do. Yeah, completely.
You guys, thank you so much. It's been so fun to have you guys here on the podcast. It's also fun to see your faces.
Yes.
So one of the things I ask everybody is, if you can think about some of your, so I make a pod sheet, at the end of every episode with a little bit of a overview if people don't have time to listen. And I also add resources. So if you guys can think about either papers that would be open source, or things that people might want to read that could bring them into this conversation about research in philanthropy, why that's important. And for people who might not even have a clear view of how to start researching in philanthropy, if there's anything that you guys can think of that we can attach to it, that'd be great. But
amazing.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you everybody for listening. It was a longer episode, but I hope it gave you a lot to think about, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. As well, check out all the links and the resources in the show notes. If you are a woman in philanthropy and would like to share your story, please get in touch. That's all for this episode. See you next time.